Welcome to another deep dive. We love to just get right into a very specific topic and really go deep on it. And I think we've got a fascinating one today. This especially is, I think, interesting for those of you listening who are really interested in, the history of philosophy.
Yeah.
So today we're going to be taking a deep dive into the world of medieval Georgian philosophy.
Okay.
And in particular, we're going to be focusing on this 12th century Georgian philosopher, Joane Petrizi. Now, I think one of the things that's really fascinating about Petrizi is that, he offers a very unique perspective on how classical philosophical ideas were received and reinterpreted during the medieval period, sort of outside of, the traditional Western European narrative that often, gets the lion's share of the attention.
Right.
And for this deep dive, our main source is going to be the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Joane Petrizi.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, especially those who are interested in philosophy, are going to find Petrizi a fascinating figure just in the kind of like the mystery that surrounds him.
Oh, really?
Because we don't have a lot of like biographical information, so we're really trying to reconstruct, his life and his thought based on, the works that he left behind. But we know that he was working in the 12th century. And that was a really, interesting period of intellectual exchange.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to uncover there.
A lot of ferment happening.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I guess, speaking of the works that Petrizi left behind, maybe this would be a good place to just kind of lay out, like, what are the key texts that we have from him that we're going to kind of be drawing on?
Sure, yeah. So there are a couple things. We have his Georgian translation of Nemesius, of Amasis on the Nature of Man.
Okay.
Nemesius was really important in the Middle Ages for thinking about the relationship between the body and soul.
Oh, wow.
So that's interesting that Petrizi, chose to translate this work. But really the main source that we're going to be looking at today is Petrizi's Georgian translation of and detailed commentary on Proclus's Elementatio Theologica.
Okay. So this commentary on Proclus, this sounds like it's, really kind of the main event for understanding his philosophical contributions.
Right.
So maybe just to kind of like set the stage for a philosopher listening, what was so significant about Petrizi's interpretation of Proclus?
Okay, so, as philosophers, we're always kind of interested in, how these ideas are, transmitted and interpreted over time.
Yeah.
And what's really, really fascinating about Petrizi is that he interprets Proclus what we call immanently.
Okay.
So that means that he's not trying to bring in later philosophical ideas or frameworks to understand Proclus. He's really trying to understand him on his own terms, from within Proclus's own philosophical system.
Gotcha.
And what this means is that his commentary is an absolutely essential source for understanding the reception of Proclus, particularly in the medieval period. But what's really interesting is that a lot of the standard critical editions of Proclus's work either have overlooked Petrizi's insights, or as Dodds points out in his 1963 edition, have even unjustly criticized his work. It makes you wonder if there's maybe some bias there.
Yeah, it's
and the way that the Western philosophical tradition has kind of maybe overlooked some of these really important figures.
It makes you think.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess the big question then is, how does studying Petrizi actually kind of help us to fill in those gaps?
Yeah.
And get a more complete picture of how Proclus was received in the medieval period.
Yeah. So I think if we look at Petrizi alongside other important interpreters of Proclus, so you have thinkers like Nicholas of Methone or Berthold of Moosburg or Henry Bate of Mechlin in the Latin West. And then you also have earlier Byzantine figures like Michael Sellers and John Idalos. When we kind of put all these figures together, we start to get a much richer and more nuanced understanding of the different ways in which Proclus was being understood in these different, centers of learning.
Yeah.
And Petrizi, he really provides a crucial perspective that we wouldn't have otherwise.
Yeah, and it's interesting, too, because it seems like, different eras and different intellectual traditions have their kind of philosophical heroes and villains.
Yeah.
And it's noted here that Petrizi had a very, very high regard for Platonic philosophy. How did he kind of situate Plato himself and other figures within that tradition.
So Petrizi really saw Platonic philosophy as a kind of continuous tradition that went all the way back to figures like, Orpheus and Pythagoras,
Okay.
and obviously included Plato. But what's really interesting is that he calls Plato the philosopher of the day,
Okay.
and he reserves the term, the philosopher, for Proclus, which is really interesting because in the Latin Middle Ages, that title was usually given to Aristotle.
Yeah.
So this tells us a lot about kind of where Patrici's philosophical allegiances lie,
Yeah.
and what he saw as, kind of the pinnacle of philosophical wisdom.
And did Petrizi engage with, specific works of Plato or Aristotle in his commentary?
So he definitely did. He references a number of Plato's dialogues. He mentions, the Parmenides, which is all about, the one. And he also mentions the laws, Phaedrus, Phaedo, the Timaeus. And then we also have some indications that he's also quoting from the Theaetetus and Symposium. So it seems like he had a pretty good knowledge of Plato's works. He also references some of Aristotle's works. But it's interesting that he seems to have avoided any of the pseudo-Aristotelian works that were very influential in the scholastic tradition in the West. And then as far as Proclus's works go, he was obviously deeply familiar with the Elementatio Theologica, but his interpretation shows us that he was also familiar with some of Proclus's other works,
Okay.
like his commentaries on the Parmenides and the Timaeus and his Platonic theology. And he brings in these other Proclean texts when they're relevant for interpreting the Elementatio.
So, given this kind of background, this engagement with, Plato and the Neoplatonic tradition, including Proclus, what would you say is the central driving force behind Patrizi's commentary? Like, what was the core philosophical question that he was really grappling with?
So I would say that Petrizi sees the main goal of Proclus's Elementatio Theologica as proving the existence and nature of the much discussed one. And this is, this is like a really kind of a key concept in a lot of ancient philosophy and medieval philosophy, this idea of the one as the ultimate source of all reality and all knowledge.
Right.
And Petrizi takes this very, very seriously. He argues that the one is not just another being in the cosmos. It's something that's, prior to being, more fundamental than being. And he says that it has to be demonstrable syllogistically.
Okay.
So through logical necessity.
Gotcha.
He says that if we can't prove that this ultimate unity exists, then the very possibility of knowledge is undermined.
Okay.
So for Petrizi, this is like the absolute bedrock of philosophical inquiry.
A bold assertion.
Yeah.
So how does he kind of flesh out this concept of the one as the source from which everything else originates?
Okay. So Petrizi follows Proclus very closely in understanding the one as the ultimate source of all multiplicity.
Okay.
So he says, if you have any kind of ordered series or chain of beings, it has to start with a single first principle. Right. Otherwise, you'd have this infinite regress, where every cause would need another cause and so on.
Yeah.
So there has to be a first principle that doesn't depend on anything else. And that first principle for Petrizi is the one. He says that the one is, the cause of all being, but it's superior to everything that it causes. It doesn't derive any of its characteristics or perfections from its effects. In fact, he says that it's precisely the one that confers, selfness or individual existence to other entities because it's self-sufficient.
Yeah.
It doesn't need anything else.
And how does Petrizi connect this idea of the one to the concept of the good?
Right. So for Petrizi, the one and the good are basically identical.
Okay.
He says that the one is the primordial good, and that's the archetype in which all creatures participate, to the extent that they have good qualities.
No.
So he makes a distinction between the good in itself, which is this transcendent principle that's beyond all finite existence, and then all the good things that we find in the world. The good in itself is absolutely pure, unmixed, and it's the standard of goodness, and it's the ultimate goal of all being. So everything strives towards the good because everything tends back to its cause, and the good is the ultimate cause.
So it's clear that Petrizi wasn't just passively kind of, transmitting these ideas from Proclus. It sounds like he was really actively engaging with them, offering his own interpretations and analysis.
Yeah.
And kind of, enriching Proclus's thought in a lot of ways. So how does he approach this really important philosophical idea of the relationship between cause and effect?
Okay, so in his commentary, Petrizi really delves into the whole dialectic of cause and cause, and he does so in a way that's in some ways more detailed and nuanced than Proclus's own treatment of it in the Alimentatio.
Okay.
So while Proclus is very abstract and kind of mathematical, Petrizi brings in lots of concrete examples from human experience and
Yeah.
observation. And it seems like he's trying to make this really complex work more accessible to a wider audience.
I like that.
Yeah, it's very helpful.
And the outline also mentions that Petrizi was critical of Aristotelian causality, which, for any philosopher is a pretty,
Right.
big deal.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what were his main points of contention there?
So Petrizi thought that the traditional four-cause system in Aristotle, the material cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause, and the final cause, he thought that this system was basically inadequate,
Okay.
especially for explaining the ultimate origin of reality.
Right.
So he follows Proclus in arguing for the necessity of a fifth type of cause, which is the creative cause.
Yeah.
And he says that Aristotle and his commentators like Alexander of Aphrodisias, that they really underestimated the importance of this creative cause. And you can really see Petrizi's commitment to the Platonic tradition here, because he's really trying to articulate these fundamental principles of existence.
Yeah. It's fascinating to see how these different systems are being debated and, kind of weighed against each other
Yeah,
during this period.
absolutely.
Now, the outline also touches on Petrizi's epistemology, his theory of knowledge. What were his key ideas there about the nature and power of human reason?
So Petrizi's epistemology really emphasizes the role of reason as active and productive.
Okay.
He says that human reason doesn't just perceive being that's already there. It actually has the power to, in a way, posit or constitute being itself.
Okay.
So reason is a kind of a determinative principle for Petrizi.
So his ideas obviously had a lot of influence in Georgia, but how far did his influence extend beyond Georgia's borders?
So Petrizi is actually the most widely read and
Yes.
influential Georgian philosopher in history.
Wow.
And his Proclus commentary and his Georgian translation of the Alimentatio Theologica, they had a huge influence not only in Georgia but also beyond.
Okay.
So in 1248, an Armenian monk named Sphimion translated Petrizi's commentary into Armenian.
Oh, yeah.
And that Armenian translation really played an important role in introducing Proclus's ideas to Armenian intellectual circles.
Okay.
And later on in the 17th century, Armenian philosophers engaged with Proclus. And in 1651, Sphimion Shugaizi, he wrote his own commentaries on the Alimentatio Theologica, and he was clearly drawing on this earlier Armenian translation of Petrizi.
Okay. It's amazing to see how these ideas travel and get reinterpreted in these different cultural contexts.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how did later Georgian thinkers kind of engage with Petrizi's legacy?
Right. So during the Georgian Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries,
Yeah.
you see a whole range of responses to Petrizi's philosophical tradition. So Sultan Saba or Beliani, in his Georgian dictionary, he actually incorporates a lot of Petrizi's terminology, especially his definitions of basic philosophical terms like being,
Right.
causality, motion,
Gotcha.
and knowledge. And Anton Bagrationi, in his treatise Picali, he draws heavily on Petrizi's interpretation. He adopts a lot of Neo-Platonic ideas, especially about the intellect or nous, and he even adopts Petrizi's specific noetic terminology.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is that Anton Bagrationi was also critical of the Armenian translation of the Alimentatio Theologica.
Right.
He really argued for the superiority of Petrizi's original Georgian version.
Gotcha.
Whereas Joane Bertioni, in his work, Komasoba, he relied more heavily on the Armenian commentaries.
So Petrizi became this kind of touchstone
Yeah.
for later Georgian thinkers, even if they had, different perspectives on how to interpret him or how to transmit his ideas.
Yeah.
So what about more recent scholarship? Has there been kind of a renewed interest in Petrizi?
Yeah, definitely. So while Petrizi's always been recognized as an important figure in Georgian philosophy, the 20th century really marked the beginning of a more comprehensive and rigorous scholarly engagement with his work.
Gotcha.
So A major kind of turning point was the publication of critical editions and translations of his philosophical writings, starting in 1937 with the publication of the second volume of his Proclus commentary, which is called Interpretation. And then there have been, other editions and translations into Russian and German.
Wow.
And these editions have really made it possible for scholars to study Patrici's work in more depth.
So it sounds like, to kind of bring our deep dive to a close, Joane Petrizi really emerges as a pivotal figure in the history of medieval philosophy, not
Yeah.
just as a translator, but as a real interpreter of Neoplatonism.
Right.
Um, and I think his commentary on Proclus really gives us invaluable insights into how these ideas were transmitted and understood in different cultures and different historical periods.
Absolutely.
And I think his focus on this idea of the one,
Yeah.
his really sophisticated understanding of causality, I think that really has lasting significance for philosophers today.
Yeah, I think it really does. And it also makes you think about the role of translation and commentary in the
Yeah.
history of philosophy. Patrizi's work really shaped how people understood Proclus
Mhm.
for centuries. So it makes you think about, our own interpretations
Mhm.
of philosophical texts and, how they might be used by people in the future.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating
Yeah,
kind of a thought experiment.
it is. So if any of you listening out there are interested in learning more about Neoplatonism or Proclus or
Hmm.
the history of Georgian philosophy, we highly recommend checking out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Joane Petrizi.
Yeah, it's a great place to start.
Yeah, it's a really good starting point. So thank you for joining us for another deep dive, and we'll see you next time.